So just like we've done before with our previous roadmap, we're going to do a little bit of a brief recap of the year so far, what we've delivered, and then spend a bit more time with what we're working on, and Rudy's going to talk a little bit about Payara Cloud as well. And we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. So please feel free to drop a question in the chat or in the Q&A section, and I'll send that to the guys when they're ready to see it as well. But yeah, feel free to talk away, add any queries in the chat as much as you like. Real, thank you very much. Steve, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Jaden. So as Jaden said, this is one of the quarterly roadmaps. It's the summer roadmap update from August 2021. We tend to work on like an annual cycle. So a big launch roadmap will be in beginning of the calendar year. This one I'm going to cover. Basically, I'm going to talk a lot about Jakarta EE. We're at a critical moment on Jakarta EE initiative at the Eclipse Foundation. So I'm going to talk about that and how we're approaching it at Payara. So, and our approach for Jakarta EE support. So a lot of the roadmap webinar will be really talking around how we're doing that support and how basically what is the timeline that we think we have about supporting the core standards within the Payara platform. I'll touch a little bit on Payara 6, Payara 5, E9, E10. And then again, I'll basically talk a little bit around how we see the Payara platform supporting Jakarta EE developers across sort of different types of architecture, and how that feeds into what's happening with Payara Cloud. We're getting very close to opening up Payara Cloud to customers and developers. And then Rudy will go into a demo of that as well. So as I mentioned, we're in a critical transition point in Jakarta EE to the Eclipse Foundation, and how that impacts the Payara platform and you as developers of Jakarta EE, Java EE applications. So I thought I'd quickly summarize this. I spoke about this in quite a lot of tech talks and myth webinars and things, but I think from a context of how we're approaching it in the Payara platform, that it's a very useful thing to just sort of recap again. So as people probably know, Java EE 8 was the last release out of the JCP, out of the Oracle controlled Java community process. And that was in August 2017. It was a smallish update from Java EE 7, but that was the final one in JCP. And around that time, just after that, it was decided that basically Java EE would transition to a more open organization and more an open source organization. And the Eclipse Foundation was chosen, if my memory is correct, sometime around sort of the end of that year. And the transition process that we were undertaking was, first, we would release Jakarta EE 8. Jakarta EE 8 would be binary compatible with Java EE 8. So what that would mean is, all the APIs would be identical. They would just be released out of the Eclipse Foundation rather than via Oracle. And what that also meant was that the licensing of the TCKs, the specifications, the APIs would all change to different licenses. So, for example, the APIs are now under the EPL license. And this was a big thing from a Payara perspective, because Jakarta EE 8 was much more free in its licensing. And in the Eclipse Foundation, it actually meant that we could deliver a Jakarta EE 8 compatible implementation and basically pass the TCK to prove that the Payara platform supported Jakarta EE 8. And we couldn't do that previously because we weren't licensees of the TCK for a couple of reasons. The first was that we were aware that it was going to migrate to the Eclipse Foundation. As if you remember, those who followed us quite closely, we were actually founded in 2016, so just before Java EE 8 came out. And also there were quite large fees a lot associated with TCK, and as we were a startup, you know, we couldn't take those fees at that point in time, knowing that it was going to move to the Eclipse Foundation. So we could release Payara Platform 5 as an EE8 compatible runtime. And then the next step in the Eclipse Foundation was to move to EE9, and what that involved was the namespace change from JAVX to Jakarta, because basically JAVX was still getting used in the JDK, and therefore it was a trademark of Oracle. And obviously they didn't want to mix up what was JDK classes and what was classes from a totally different foundation, independent foundation. So Jakarta was chosen, and basically the approach was to move everything again, keep the same APIs, but just move everything into the Jakarta namespace. And EE9 was more of a tooling release. So that came in 2020. It moved everything into the Jakarta namespace, maintaining exactly the same APIs as we had in EE8, but just in the new namespace, and a new TCK that obviously supported the new namespace, and you could test your applications against. The key goal of EE9, though, was for tooling vendors like ourselves, for third-party library developers, for frameworks, IDEs, and etc., to basically have a target they could use to migrate and move the whole ecosystem to the new namespace. Obviously, that's a massive undertaking, and that's still ongoing. And 9.1 came out in May this year. That was really just a minor change to the TCK, especially allowing it to execute in Java 11, so that you could run the TCK on Java 11, whereas previously you could only run the TCK on Java 8. Application server runtimes like Payara and things are already running on 8 and supported on 11, and supporting Jakarta EE8 on JDK 11 before that time, but they couldn't run the test suite on 11, so we had to run the test suite on 8. So that was completed this year, and why that is key is because, as we'll see later in the presentation, that all the transition to Eclipse Foundation has taken almost 4 years, but is complete, done, finished. And now we are at the point of moving forward these APIs, and I'll talk a little bit about, you know, what that entails. Obviously, Jakarta EE, the sort of ecosystem hasn't frozen for all that time, because we've had microprofile, and we've been involved in the microprofile initiative, and microprofile sits on top of Jakarta EE and builds, you know, extensions and APIs that sit on a core Jakarta EE base. And again, Payara has supported that initiative from day one, and is, as we'll see on the standards timeline, as we're still supporting those APIs. Both in microprofile and Jakarta EE initiative live at the Eclipse Foundation, and they have very similar members, not exactly the same, but very, very similar. And they also have, you know, very similar governance and licensing and things. So that's where we are from a standards perspective. What I want to cover now is how we're approaching the support of these APIs. So I've talked about this before, but it's worth reiterating. So what we're doing at the moment is in Payara 5, we are supporting the deployment of Jakarta EE9 applications. Payara 5 is a Jakarta EE8 compatible runtime. As I mentioned before, basically Jakarta EE9 is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same APIs as 8, but within the Jakarta namespace, in the package namespace. So what we do when you drop a Jakarta EE9 application, or you deploy it onto Payara 5, is that we actually use a tool internally called Transformer. And what that does is it moves classes that are in the Jakarta namespace into the old equivalent Jakarta EE8 JAVX namespace. So we detect classes and we move them, At deployment time, we also detect service definitions, deployment descriptors, and some properties and things that are required to run on, take a 9 application and run it on 8. So this is basically there to allow you to start experimenting with EE9. To be honest, from an application development point of view, EE9 is identical to EE8. So there's, other than playing in the new namespace, there's no real reason from a pure from an application developer perspective to worry about moving to EE9. In the future, which is probably more important, when we release Payara 6, Payara 6 is targeted to be a Jakarta EE 10 runtime. So, and because people will have a lot of EE8 applications, the transformer becomes a lot more important. So to provide backwards compatibility and to support older applications deploying on the Payara 6 platform, then we're going to run the transforming the other direction. So we will detect EE8 applications and we'll move them into the new EE10 runtime, so into the new namespace. So we'll be taking those the JAVX references and moving them into Jakarta. And this will allow you to take applications and run them on the latest platforms so that you won't become sort of stuck if your application is in the old namespace. So this is key for us from, this is one of the great advantages of Java EE and Jakarta EE is that, we are a managed runtime for you. You can write your applications and against the APIs, and then we can do lots of things to make sure that those applications can continue to be supported and continue to be run successfully on the latest platforms and the latest JDKs. So a lot of the work we're doing with 9 transforming for Payara 5 is really about building that compatibility layer and understanding it as we move it towards Payara Platform 6 release. So essentially 6 will be an EE10 runtime, and part, as we'll see in the later slide, the timeline of 6 will be largely dependent on EE10 development. Saying that, we have released Payara 6 Alpha 1. So that's download from our website. It is Jakarta EE compatible for Jakarta EE 9.1. So it's a fully compatible version of Jakarta EE 9.1. It runs completely in the Jakarta namespace, but at this point in time, it doesn't currently support transforming 8 applications to 9 because it's 8 applications to 9 because it's an alpha release at the moment. So we've started that work on building Jakarta namespace support natively and building the next version of the Payara 6 platform. So one of the questions really is if you want to try out Jakarta EE 9, where should you look from a Payara perspective? So just to summarize some of the things I've said. So the Payara 5 platform will continue to support deploying Jakarta EE 9 applications. So again, what we're doing here is we're basically understanding what's required to transform applications from one version to another. If you hit an issue running a Jakarta EE 9 application on Payara 5, we would consider that as a bug. If it runs smoothly on in the old namespace, but it won't run in the new namespace on 5, then we would consider that a bug, and we encourage you to raise it on GitHub. As I said, Payara 5 is using transformation. Currently, Payara 5, because it actually is an EE8 application server, can't pass the Jakarta EE 9.1 TCK for simple reasons, really, in that the TCK in places does string compares of class names. And obviously, we have the old class names in the old namespace running in the application server after your application has been transformed. So if it does a string compare that we threw an exception that says Jakarta.something.exception, then obviously we're not throwing that exception, we're throwing javx.something.exception. So from very technical reasons, it can't pass the TCK. However, as I say, we are trying to fully support deploying EE9 applications in 5. This currently is community only. It's not in Payara 5 Enterprise, that support, for a couple of reasons. One, well, we haven't seen the demand. Two is that, to be honest, there's no real reason to build new applications in EE9 at this point in time, because it's exactly the same as EE8. However, if someone pushes for that from a customer perspective, then it's possible that we may rethink that. But at this point in time, these transformation support from 9 to 8 applications is for community. Payara 6 Alpha. Payara 6 Alpha, as it's sort of got on here, is a start of evolving the platform to support Jakarta EE10. So the first step on that journey was to become Jakarta EE 9.1 compatible. So this is a full compatible implementation. It has passed the TCKs, but it is an evolving beast. So it isn't just an Alpha 1 at the moment. So again, there's no enterprise version of Payara 6. And there won't be for a while, as we'll see in the next slide. We haven't built support for deploying EE8 applications into 6 yet by transforming to Jakarta. That will obviously happen at some point, because we need to build that for when we do release 6 and provide that level of support. So what does that mean on a sort of timeline? So I'm really talking about core standards here for the roadmap. So there's a couple of core standards. Well, there's 3 things that we're tracking from a core standards perspective. One is obviously JDK version, another is microprofile version, and the third is EE9 support. So as you can see, this year we basically shipped microprofile 4 support in Q1. Q2 we shipped the ability to deploy EE9 applications to 5 with the initial releases of that, and that support is improving as we move down the year. Then this quarter that we're in currently, we basically shipped Payara 6 Alpha 1 that has a full Jakarta 9.1 compatibility, and we're about to ship microprofile 4.1 support, which will be done sometime this quarter. And then looking forward, as we look at basically the standards timeline, we're looking to support JDK 17 next quarter. So obviously JDK 17 will be coming out very soon as a new LTS version of the JDK. The Payara 5 will be supporting JDK 17 in the Q4. And again, what we're likely to do after that is microprofile 5 support will come into the 6 Alpha. That's because microprofile 5 is targeting the Jakarta namespace. So that is the migration of microprofile on top of the Jakarta namespace. So we will support that on the 6 stream as we start building that out. So as we looking forward again into next year, we believe the dates have not been set, but we're assuming that Jakarta EE10 will be shipped sometime in Q1 next year. It may be Q1 or maybe Q2, but whenever that hits, then we'll be basically looking to get Payara 6 as an EE10 compatible implementation, very close to the Jakarta EE10 release date. And with going alongside that, we would want transformation from 8 applications to 10 applications to be shipped with that release when it comes out. We will ship EE10 support first in the community version, and then later on, probably one quarter later, we'll be shipping Payara 6 Enterprise. So we'll ship betas first into community, and then finally we'll ship 6 Enterprise sometime first half of next year. Some of these, like I said, these timelines are somewhat dependent on when EE10 comes out, because EE10 support is the key really to releasing a Payara 6 platform. So what is coming in EE10? And EE10 is just created their release plans. There are a number of things that are in here. It's just a random list that I picked. There's quite a lot of improvements to various specifications. Each of the specifications is a separate project at Eclipse Foundation, and if you want to shape these specifications, then you can get involved and do that. So there's going to be a lot of JAX-RS improvements. There's a lot of activity there. I've got some plans around concurrency. Jakarta config may drop, which could be something similar to microprofile config, could be identical to microprofile config, or it could be something slightly different. However, that is slated for EE10. And then there's obviously updates to lots of specifications like servlets. It will be targeting JDK 17 support, so we should be able to run the TCKs on JDK 17. And then some of the other things that are in there are CDI Lite, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And there's going to be work on the TCKs to separate them and things like that. And there's a lot of other improvements. And most of these are in the different projects that are Eclipse Foundation. The date of that is to be confirmed. And as I said, the date of it will determine where we are on releasing the Payara 6 platform. So one of the things I did want to pick up on specifically on Jakarta EE10 is the core profile. So the core profile is something that a team has been created to work on, which will actually produce a smaller profile of Jakarta EE10. It may not come out at the same time as Jakarta EE10, it may come out after the full platform. And that's because what it's doing is it wants to create a profile of Jakarta EE specs that targeted smaller runtimes. So it may facilitate GraalVM support and native image compilation, but it's not necessarily its key goal. And what that will include would be its own independent TCK, so we can certify products to core profile compatible. It will likely have in something called CDI Lite, which is really about removing parts of CDI that are problematic for ahead of time compilation. So CDI extensions is one of those things which you obviously, because it hooks in at deployment time, then it's quite difficult for ahead of time compilation to deal with. So it'll be like taking a core profile of CDI and making it suitable for ahead of time compilation. And then it will likely have similar things for that microprofile currently has now. So JAX-RS, beam validation, JSON processing, JSON binding, and potentially some others. Personally, I'd quite like to get Jakarta concurrency in there because that's very fundamental as well, but that may or may not happen. And there'll be sort of arguments around which specifications are in light and which ones aren't, and which ones are in core and which ones aren't. So that is a key thing, and we'll be targeting and following this profile quite closely. So we will aim to target a product that is core profile compatible. Again, timelines on that are probably middle to late next year, depending on when this profile drops and how much work gets done on it and when EE10 drops. So that would likely to be something that would be based on potentially Payara Micro, but with more cut down again and potentially supporting GraalVM. So that's a lot more in the future. So now I'm going to turn a little bit about Payara Cloud and talk about, basically, we've shown this slide quite a lot. What we're trying to do on the Payara platform is enable Jakarta EE developers to write applications once and package them up in a Jakarta EE deployment, and then for us to provide a suite of runtimes that supports scale and different types of devices. So on the left-hand side, Payara Micro, which could potentially, as I said, be core profile in the future. Then we want that to be small and target peer-to-peer type models in containers on IoT, on Edge or whatever, going through to Payara Server, which is a traditional domain. So that has a multi-server setup with administration console, clustering and failover and all those other things that you need from a runtime like that, right up to Payara Cloud. So where Payara Cloud is sitting is, we see this as Jakarta EE Runtime, that is absolutely native to cloud platforms and Kubernetes. So this will sit on top of the cloud platforms and manage a lot of the, what at the end of the day is infrastructure complexity from a Jakarta EE developer. So this is sort of building on that standard Java EE deployment model. So where we take an application and you build your application using our Jakarta EE APIs, and then we provide all the management of the runtime and the compute infrastructure. So the beauty of the Jakarta EE model is that as a developer, you shouldn't really have to worry about whether you're deploying your application onto a small device or whether you're deploying it on a global scale hybrid cloud or something like that. From an application business logic, it shouldn't matter. From an infrastructure point of view, then that's what the Payara platform is there to do. So our real model is, your job as Jakarta developers is to build applications. You don't need to worry about the application infrastructure, the compute infrastructure that's underneath. This obviously can evolve, as I said, from small devices through to containers, individual containers, through to application servers on multiple VMs or multiple containers, or maybe sat on top of Kubernetes or sat on top of multiple clouds. So really what our job as application server runtime developers is to build and abstract a lot of that infrastructure away from you so you can just take a WAR file and deploy it. And that is the key basic premise behind Payara Cloud. So the premise behind Payara Cloud is you take a Jakarta EE application, you deploy it, and it becomes live running on a cloud infrastructure on top of Kubernetes, without you having to worry about YAML files, containers, and on all that sort of stuff, which, to be honest, is compute infrastructure. So what we're going to do now is Rudy's going to do a demo just to show that, and I'll stop my sharing. And so he'll do a demo of Payara Cloud just so that you can see that for real. And Payara Cloud, as we say, we're getting very close to a public release of that.
Yes, a short demo. So I try to create a demo with as possible all the features. So it probably will go very fast, but yeah, you always have the recording, of course, afterwards if you want to have a look back at what we discussed. So your Payara Cloud journey starts on the website, where you can subscribe for one of the plans that we have predefined for you. The basic one, which is a limited amount of CPUs for some small environments. And then the standard one is more about the typical application requirements with more CPUs. And of course, we also have a premium version where you have a fully supported environment where you can also get tickets and access to our engineers if you need them. So when clicking on the subscribe, then since everything is automated online, you first need to create the Payara Cloud account. You can do that by username and password, or you can use the Google and GitHub authentication. And then you end up with a screen with a few more details, because we need, for instance, a contact name and an email address where we send invoices to for your legal obligations. And then we have some more details around invoicing, like invoicing address, the payment, the credit card, because it's online through a credit card, and then the confirmation that you agree with the terms and conditions. Once that is all set, you end up on the Payara Cloud console. I have here, of course, now already a lot of subscriptions, because I'm playing with it, I'm creating demos, but you can always create a new namespace, and the namespace is running your applications. That namespace needs a project name and a stage, like desktop production, so that you can distinguish between your phases. And you also specify the region. So we have Europe and the United States as a region where you can run your container and your application. Once that namespace is created, you can immediately start uploading an application, and you need a WAR file following the web profile standard and of the Jakarta specification. That can be, for instance, using a database. So this example connects to a database application. You can deploy immediately, but that will not work here, of course, because you need to define the connection, as you will see in a moment. And you can specify a specific name instead of relying on the file name of the WAR. And then when you perform the upload, he analyzes the WAR file and sees that it is unconfigured because, as I mentioned, you need to configure that database configuration. So you see then the screen where you can enter those values. He has detected that there is one of the units is using this JNDI name, and then you need to specify the data source for the database driver, username and password, and the other parameters of the connection pool, like minimum size. You can also specify the context route where the application lives. By default, that's also that application name. And you can define some what's called internet accessible paths, because there is the option that you do not expose your entire application to the internet, but you have some endpoints that are used by other applications within the same namespace, so like a microservice architecture. On the same configuration screen, you can define the size of the runtime. So you have the possibility to define the default, although you can go over this amount. This is just a standard default value, but if you need more CPU, then it goes over that assigned amount. Here I did not completely fill in, so that's why I cannot save it and cannot deploy it, because I don't have a database ready to show this application. Let's switch to a other application that I already provided. You see there it is deployed, and you have that then a URL where you can have access to that deployed application. And when putting in the information of that endpoint, like here, that is a standard REST point, then you can see that if you put a parameter, that he takes the parameter and returns the classic hello world. So the application is performing, the entire system is performing for you the setup of the routing for your application, but also creating, also requesting SSL certificates and making sure that the entire chain between the browser and your application is under SSL control. By default, we generate a name there. You see that URL name, that host name, which is based on the namespace, the namespace names and the stage. But of course, that is probably not what you want in many cases. So with the basic and the premium subscription, you have the possibility to assign a custom domain to it. So when you're owning a domain like mycompany.com, then you can assign your application a custom domain name like app.mycompany.com, and then you can define it. During the test, it was already assigned to one of my other domains, so I needed to change it to the myapp.mycompany.com, for instance. And then you need to use that information to set as CNAME in your DNS or in the DNS server of your provider. So you can even copy some basic information so that you don't need to type. And when everything is entered, you can click on the check DNS to see if all configuration is done properly, so that from that moment on, that your custom domain name is properly also routed to that application that you have deployed within that namespace. Here it fails, of course, because mycompany.com, it maybe does not even exist, and certainly I don't own that, so I cannot give the correct CNAME in the system. Let's switch to some monitoring and other capabilities. You have a data warehouse where we store like log entries, the number of HTTP requests. For instance, those are those requests that that you saw earlier. You also see memory and CPU consumption, but you also have the capability to search the log here from online. There will also be a download button, and then you can, for instance, search in the log for every warning message, for every severity. We search it in every field, so not only severity but also in the message itself. And then, for instance, here you see that there pops up a few entries because I was using an older version of Payara Micro at that time, which has some certificates expired. There are also some more advanced queries possible where you require certain terms or exclude a few terms, and you can always specify the period from until the to period where you want to search the log for. And by default, the log is kept for 7 days. So afterwards, it is automatically purged so that it does not take up too much space. Beside that, logging, sometimes you need to look more into deep what is going on within the JVM. So you also have the possibility to create heap dumps and thread dumps, just as you can do with regular JVMs. You can just click on that one and then you get a file downloaded which contains the classic heap dump from a JVM. You can open that in a text editor. And then if you are expert in thread dumps, you can analyze it from here, of course, but you can also, of course, upload it in a tool which gives you some information about what's going on. Later on, you will see that those heap and thread dumps are also available for 7 days so that you can re-download them later on. That's about the monitoring. What about new versions? So you can change the configuration. You can upload a new binary, and by changing the configuration, you create a new revision of your application, which you can then deploy later on. For instance, here I want to change the context route, or I can change also the runtime size. Then when that new revision is created, it's not live immediately. It's ready to be deployed. So when you think the time is ready, you can click on deploy, and the entire machinery is set to to make that new version live. That can take up to a minute because we need to change, of course, the routing and change the deployed application. You see also here that the information is updated, so the URL, because I changed the context route, and you have another version deployed. Maybe you have uploaded a new binary and there was an issue, so you want to go back to a previous one. So you can do that by checking on that the first and click on the refer to this revision, and then it takes a copy of that one and you can deploy that immediately again. So that's an easy way to go back to an older version to do rollback of a deployment. And then the older version, which was available under revision 0, is then now available under revision 2, and it is made available to the end users. As you see here at the bottom, you saw that table there with all the diagnostic exports. For instance, that there was that thread dump, which I clicked and that I have already downloaded, but you can download it again with this download button. There is one thing that I also want to say about configuration. We did already the configuration of the database. There are also other facilities created for microprofile configuration. So if you upload an application that is using microprofile config and it has a microprofile config properties file, then you can change those values and you can create even additional values. you see here that the status is configured because you have default values, but of course, those default values you can change with that same change configuration. And now you have a panel here with the properties that are found within the WAR file, but you can have others. For instance, with the data source definition, you can also link to that microprofile config properties to define the connection. So it is, we have the possibility to create some additional key value pairs. You can just enter a new key value and a new value, and then those key value pairs are stored in a secret and is used by your application. So that way you can change your microprofile config values depending on the environment that you are working on, between test and production, for instance, and then you can click deploy. Last thing that I want to mention, that you can always go back to that billing management, as you see on the left menu on the bottom, so that you can have, can you review your invoice information. You can go and have a look at the invoices which are sent out and invoices that are scheduled, and the amount that are scheduled to be taken from your credit card at the end of the period. As I mentioned, very brief, so you can always look at the recording, but that's these are the major functionality and features that we have ready for the launch of Payara Cloud. Back to you, Steve, for the latest few points.
Okay.
We did have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first one from Richard Grin. Payara Cloud is very interesting. It won't be free if you already have a subscription to a cloud provider, even for education.
No,
a question.
Yeah, it has a question mark on the end, which threw me.
Okay.
It is indeed not free because we are hosting the application, so we also pay for the hosting and for the CPUs, and we also use, and of course, the Payara Cloud, which is an advantage over the when you do it all by yourself, when you set up your Kubernetes cluster and set up the entire Payara system on the cloud provider yourself.
Yeah, that sort of feeds into long term. So when Payara Cloud comes out, it will be a hosted service by Payara, and because it's effectively like a serverless runtime for WAR, basically your Jakarta EE was. Longer term, we'll be looking at bringing a service together where you could install it, but we haven't got a timeline for that yet. So that would allow you to put it into your own subscriptions on cloud platforms. That's a long-term goal.
Okay, and the next question from Carlos says, let's say I want to convert an app to Jakarta namespace. I change all my package declarations to Jakarta, and I can run that in Payara 5 at the moment, correct? Now, since that will transform it back to JAVAX, should I expect an impact on compile or deploy time?
Okay, so yes, that should work at this point in time, that you should get be able to run that on Payara 5. That is correct. Since it will transform it back, should I expect an impact on deploy time? A small impact. I'm not aware that it's of any significance. I don't know, Rudy, if you know more about the impact.
Yeah, we did not try it, of course, with a massive, large application, but with a normal sized application, we did not see any impact on the transformation itself, on the entire deployment time.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't any massive Jakarta EE applications because a lot of the third-party libraries at the minute are not moved yet. So, so we haven't seen anything, and obviously it may have some small impact, but it's not actually doing a lot of work, so it shouldn't have a huge one.
Okay, and the next one is more of a sort of a discussion point. But Carlos asks, do I understand right that there is an intention to downgrade Payara Micro to a core profile compatible runtime? He hopes not, because he values Micro for its ease of use and configuration, and using most of Jakarta and microprofile.
Yeah, sorry if I put that impression. No, that isn't the plan. The plan isn't to kind of downgrade Payara Micro to a core profile compatible runtime. The plan is to create a new core profile compatible product. It may be based on Micro, but it may not. So Payara Micro will still be there. Payara Micro is Web Profile Plus compatible, and that product will still exist. We're looking to basically ship a new runtime that would be core profile. So there would be two.
Okay, brilliant. And that's all of them at the minute. I hope that helps, Carlos and Richard.
Okay, so thanks really for the demo. Basically, next steps, if you're interested in Payara Cloud, is to register interest on the website. Well, like I said, we're going to be launching it in very soon. And it will, as I said, be a hosted version for hosted by us on Azure, and basically provides a serverless solution for running WAR files on Azure. Initially, it'll be in multi-regions, and then we have a big roadmap for Payara Cloud, which we can talk about another time. And a lot of the capabilities, are going to you feed into ideas that we have for platform and installable products, and how you run Jakarta EE on hybrid cloud and how you run it on Kubernetes. So that's all we have. Thank you for listening. And Jaden, any more questions?
No, no questions at the minute. But feel free, guys, please visit the website and send us a message or contact us on socials, especially Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn is where you can find us most easily. And we'll do our best to get back to you and answer your question. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.